This is The Raid, exposing the dark world of America's deportation machine. I'm your host, John Carlos Frey. Nick Schwellenbach is a senior investigator at Project on Government Oversight, or POGO. He's previously been the communications director at the U.S. Office of Special Counsel, the main federal agency in charge of protecting whistleblowers. He also served on a 3-person government team that evaluated whistleblower allegations of abuses of authority, violations of journalistic independence, and other claims involving the first Senate-confirmed CEO at the U.S. Agency for Global Media. He was also a senior fiscal policy analyst with the Center for Effective Government, a staff writer with the Center for Public Integrity, and a reporter-researcher for Harvard University's Nieman Watchdog. His journalism has been published in The Washington Post, Time Magazine, Rolling Stone, The New Republic, The Intercept, Politico, The Daily Beast, Yahoo News, Mother Jones, and the Texas Observer, and as well as other media outlets. His investigative findings have been widely covered by major media outlets and are routinely cited by members of Congress conducting oversight. We're going to start a 2-part series with Nick, and our first part, part 1, will be an investigation or a look at an investigation that Nick's been working on Gregory Bovino. That's the Border Patrol agent that we have seen on camera quite a bit in the raids in Los Angeles, Chicago, and now in North Carolina. Gregory Bovino is the sector chief of the El Centro sector of the Border Patrol. Why don't we just start with Greg Bovino? Who is he?
Well, Gregory Bovino has been the chief of the El Centro sector of the Border Patrol, which is in California, and he has been since April of 2020. He's a longtime veteran of the Border Patrol. He started back in 1996, pretty early in his career, and he's become sort of one of the most visible faces of deployments of the Border Patrol and ICE in major U.S. cities this year. The Department of Homeland Security recently gave him a new title, which is Commander at Large of the Border Patrol. So that's a brand new title that they started using in some press releases a couple months ago, but you're starting to see it more and more. As far as I know, he still retains his title of chief of the El Centro sector.
So he's still the chief. So just for the audience who may not know the command structure within the U.S. Border Patrol, a sector chief is responsible for a certain area, correct? And he is responsible or the head of the El Centro sector, which is where?
Yeah, so there are 20 Border Patrol sectors across the continental United States. The El Centro sector covers a 70-mile swath of the border with Mexico. There's also the San Diego sector, which is to the west of El Centro sector. And the El Centro sector, even though it's focused on that border with Mexico and inland about 100 miles, it actually stretches all the way up to the border of Oregon and covers the Central Valley, covers Sacramento, and so it covers a fair amount of the state of California.
So you wrote an article about Gregory Bovino and the El Centro sector, which we just kind of described. And what you found was this very strange, what attracted me to call you was this very strange anomaly or evidence of kind of a corrupt use of force. That's the word that I'm using. My understanding of use of force is that Border Patrol agents can't use force unless there is some kind of a threat or they themselves are assaulted. But you found something different. Do I have that right?
That's generally right in broad strokes. So I should say, and I mentioned this briefly, that Gregory Bovino is sort of the face of these deployments in major U.S. cities, namely Los Angeles and Chicago, and he's now in charge of these forces that have deployed in Charlotte, North Carolina, which is in his home state of North Carolina. And these deployments, especially in Chicago and Los Angeles, Charlotte is still a very new deployment, but those 2 major deployments in some of the biggest cities in our country have been marked with widespread accusations of excessive use of force, many of them caught on camera or on cell phone video. There have been some major lawsuits, very notable lawsuit that's ongoing in Chicago right now, alleging excessive use of force. And Gregory Bovino, he's been interviewed by reporters. He's not shy when it comes to reporters, and he says, "Look, we use of force, and we use use of force in response to assaults on agents." So I decided to look at all the data involving use of force in assaults involving the El Centro sector, as well as the Border Patrol, the parent agency, Customs and Border Protection, and all the other sectors. And when I looked at that, the data was very eye-popping. According to agency policy, you're supposed to report every use of force incident and every assault. There's a few tiny carve-outs, but generally they're supposed to report all these things. The data shows that the use of force in the El Centro sector is substantially higher than the Border Patrol overall and any other Border Patrol sector, including the sort of second-ranked sector of Tucson, which covers most of Arizona. And it was just such a striking departure from the rest of the agency over a 4-year period. And so that 4-year period is also notable, I want to mention, because we're not cherry picking one particular year where something weird might have happened. We're not cherry picking one particular month. We're looking at 4 years across the whole agency, and these are agents reporting these incidents, not accusations from bystanders or victims, but these are the agents themselves reporting this data. So there's also a separate question of how are they shading the data? But if we take the data at face value, they're using force 3.6 times compared to every incident of assault that they face. There are a couple other scenarios where they can use force. If someone's evading arrest, they can use force. But it is such a departure from the rest of the agency. You have to raise questions about what are sort of leadership tone inside of the El Centro sector. What are agents disciplined or not disciplined for doing inside of that sector? And so what are sort of the practices and leadership and organizational culture inside of that sector? And why is it so different than the rest of the Border Patrol?
Let me ask you a couple questions about that because it can get confusing with all the numbers.
Right.
What you found, if I can summarize and tell me if I'm off here, that Border Patrol agents were using force against migrants for the most part, people that they may be apprehending, even when they didn't need to or when they were not being assaulted, right? So there was a use of force against the individual who they were trying to apprehend almost 4 times more often than the migrant themselves or the individual themselves assaulting the Border Patrol agent. So if they're trying to arrest someone and the migrant resists, fights back, tries to run, they're allowed to use force, or they typically use force, and you're saying they have to report it. But somehow they used force almost 4 times more often, and nothing else was happening. I mean, is that how you see it? That the Border Patrol agents used force on this individual, and they may not have been doing anything to deserve it? Is that kind of the way you can describe that?
Well, the Border Patrol would probably say that there are some other circumstances, such as people evading arrest, not complying with commands, that could justify use of force. So there are some scenarios aside from assaulting agents where, at least according to Customs and Border Patrol's use of force policy, can justify use of force.
But they would have to put that in their report, right? That the individual was evading arrest, and you're finding that there was no reason for use of force.
Yeah, I'm not necessarily arguing there was no reason for it, but the statistics show that. So I want to mention that the Border Patrol-wide stat is 2 uses of force to every 1 assault incident, whereas El Centro, it's 3.6 to 1. And Tucson, it's about 2.6 or 2.7 to 1. And so El Centro, even compared to Tucson, is still kind of off the charts here. So, there's a lot of ways to look at a lot of these numbers, but and a lot of people already argue that Border Patrol as a whole is already using excessive force. So I want to mention that. But even within the Border Patrol, the use of force is off the charts. And this is where it's sort of drilling into anecdotes, I think, becomes really telling. There are incidents such as those in Chicago where a federal judge said use of force by Border Patrol agents, quote unquote, shocks the conscience. And there are incidents where Bovino claimed that he deployed tear gas or chemical agents only in response to being hit in the head with a rock. It turned out in the course of that lawsuit, as they deposed him, as they reviewed the evidence, that wasn't the case at all. And the judge even called out Bovino and implied that he's not an honest broker here, and that he actually wasn't hit in the head before he threw a rock. And there are other incidents where there are claims of assault on agents, where the assault is maybe, I think a lot of people would raise questions about whether or not it should even be called an assault. A really well-known incident recently is the Sandwich Guide case out of Washington, D.C., where this former Justice Department attorney who's been disgusted with some of these deployments in Washington threw a Subway sandwich against a CBP officer, and, it was labeled an assault. They tried to charge him with a felony. Grand jury wouldn't indict the guy twice. They finally charged him with a misdemeanor charge of assault, and a jury still acquitted the person at the end of the day. So I just want to point out that I think there's limits to what the statistics themselves show, but I think the statistics raise some real serious questions about, do they have a culture of condoning excessive use of force in the El Centro sector?
I have heard, we're talking about statistics, and it's my understanding that the Border Patrol, for the most part, when you're looking at statistics, are responsible for those stats, right? They're the ones who are filling out the reports. So you're going to have to go by what they say. Are they falsifying reports?
So I didn't get into this in my story, and it's something that may lead to a follow-up piece that we do. But if you look at the government statistics on use of force and assaults throughout this year, you see spikes in use of force in the sectors where Bovino has been deployed. So, for instance, you see a notable spike in the use of force in the San Diego sector, which encompasses Los Angeles, in June. You also see, by the way, a spike in reports of assaults on agents. But similar to the Sandwich Guy incident, we've had cases in the LA area where people who've been accused of assault have been acquitted by juries. In the Detroit sector, which encompasses Chicago, you see a spike in this fall when Bovino was deployed out there. Obviously, there's a corresponding element of they're deploying heavily in these sectors. They're getting aggressive under Bovino's command, and you're seeing use of force incidents and assaults go up. I do want to dig into this issue of we're relying on the government's data, which is based on agents-only reports. There are some other sets of data where we can get complaints from people in the public, complaints from victims, complaints from migrants and other people. And we can talk about that a little bit as well. But some of these reports are from the officers or the law enforcement agents' perspective. And so there may be a tendency to put their own actions in the best possible light. Are they capturing every use of force that they engaged in? Are they exaggerating an action from a protester or an immigrant they're arresting and claiming it's assault? And so I think that there are limitations to these statistics that I just want to point out. But even with all those limitations, it was such a striking departure from the rest of the agency, an agency that's accused writ large of using excessive force, that it was just so notable. I mean, I just had to write this piece.
There's also another piece that may be added to it, which isn't necessarily in your report, is oversight. If Border Patrol are heavy-handed with use of force, if they're using force more than they need to, who's watching? Who's reprimanding? What's happening to the individuals? If you find these kinds of statistics, which are shocking, that people with guns, agents with guns and handcuffs and tasers and all kinds of methods to deploy force, are doing it heavy-handedly, what's going to happen? What's the reprimand structure here?
That's a great question. So there are some main entities. Probably the one that looms largest at Customs and Border Protection, the parent agency of Border Patrol, is its Office of Professional Responsibility. It's essentially an internal affairs office like you see at most police departments. OPR, which is the acronym for the Office of Professional Responsibility, is sort of the main place that investigates misconduct, including alleged use of force or excessive use of force by agents at the Border Patrol. But OPR has had a long reputation of kind of going easy on agents at the Border Patrol. There also have been whistleblowers from the leadership levels at OPR over the years who allege that even when they do find big problems inside the Border Patrol, the agency itself sort of sweeps it under the rug or doesn't take discipline in reaction to OPR's findings. In recent years, OPR staffed up a lot and has tried to become more transparent. So there have been some strides forward in recent years. It's really unclear whether or not those attempts to improve oversight at the Border Patrol are going to survive under this administration, if they'll have the same commitment to trying to get their arms around problems in the agency, problems that date back decades. I do want to mention that I think a lot of these problems sort of metastasized in the aughts when the Border Patrol had a huge hiring surge during the George W. Bush administration and early part of the Obama administration. But OPR is not the only oversight entity. There's also the Office of Inspector General at the Department of Homeland Security. They have the right of first refusal in cases alleging misconduct. They tend to take a very small number of cases that might have a criminal aspect to them or that rise to a certain level, but they only, again, take on usually a small sliver of cases. There's also the ability of people who believe they have faced unnecessary excessive force to file lawsuits, but there are pretty serious legal hurdles to cross. There's a case out of Arizona that's a few years old involving a tribal member, Raymond Matea, who was shot at his home at night by several agents. The Justice Department announced back in 2023 they were not going to prosecute the case. The family has sued civilly. That case was allowed to sort of proceed in August when a federal judge found that the agent's qualified immunity defenses, didn't make the cut given the facts before that judge. But again, it is very hard to sue law enforcement agents at the federal level, be they Border Patrol agents, ICE agents, or any other federal law enforcement agents because of immunity and other sort of legal theories that have sort of grown over the years that shield them from civil liability. There's also Congress. Congress can hold oversight hearings, conduct oversight. It's a potential big player when it comes to holding an agency to account. Right now, under sort of GOP majority in both the House and Senate, there isn't a lot of at least public interest in holding the Border Patrol's feet to the fire or ICE's. I think you see a lot more interest from the Democratic side of the aisle, but right now they don't hold the gavel. They don't control the oversight agenda on committees in Congress. So there's sort of different entities, different ways to hold people accountable at different levels, but there are some severe challenges at each of those levels.
Let me ask you around that subject. Have you seen any reprimands? If agents are using force more than they're supposed to, has anybody been fired? Has anybody been, put on some kind of leave? Are there any stats on what's happening to the agents who are using excessive force?
So it's a great question. It is extraordinarily rare. There are occasionally instances where agents are held accountable. There was an instance out of New Mexico a couple years ago where a CBP officer, not a Border Patrol agent, was held accountable for basically beating up a U.S. citizen at a checkpoint in New Mexico, and he was prosecuted. But it's a very rare case. There was an interesting statistic in a Government Accountability Office report a couple years ago. And the Government Accountability Office is Congress's sort of investigative arm. They're a nonpartisan entity that does in-depth reviews. They looked at about 3,000 cases alleging excessive use of force at Customs and Border Protection, and most of these were Border Patrol cases. And they were reviewed by something called a local use of force review board. So I didn't mention these use of force review boards, but there's a national use of force review board at Customs and Border Protection, and then there are these local boards that exist in the different sectors throughout the country. Out of these 3,000 cases, the statistic was that only in 3% of those cases did those local use of force review boards find that the use of force was outside of policy, which is sort of their term of art to say it exceeded what they're supposed to do according to their policy. There are advocacy groups like the Washington Office on Latin America, which tracks Border Patrol misconduct. They commented on this sort of low rate of use of force boards finding problems and said, this is not a credible sort of review. These local use of force boards are mostly staffed by the peers of Border Patrol agents, people who also work at the Border Patrol. When you get to the National Use of Force Board, which reviews a much smaller subset of use of force incidents, usually ones that lead to death, that's staffed with a couple representatives from the Justice Department, from ICE, but it's still, they rarely find problems related to the use of force.
Have you seen any Border Patrol agent be prosecuted for excessive use of force? Are you aware of any case?
I am not aware of any case.
I mean, Nick, the fact that you had to deep breathe and think about it, I'm only, I'm saying it kind of cynically, but if LAPD beat somebody up, used excessive force, the individual didn't have a firearm or a knife, didn't assault the officer, the LAPD officer, and the policeman beat the crap out of the person, there would be hell to pay every single time. Every single time. You could file a lawsuit. There would be public outrage. That individual police officer might be prosecuted, would be put on some kind of administrative leave. I'm assuming that rarely happens, if ever, with the Border Patrol.
It is super rare. I'm really trying to be, I'm really trying to be fair to the Border Patrol here. That's why I wanted to think about it. I am unaware of any Border Patrol agent who's been criminally prosecuted for excessive use of force. I'm aware of a few people elsewhere in CBP. I mentioned the man from New Mexico. The agency tends to take, so that there's a constitutional standard that was set by the Supreme Court in the late 80s that sort of governs how this is all viewed. It's called the reasonableness standard. And the reasonableness standard is essentially, did a law enforcement agent was their use of force reasonable under the circumstances from the law enforcement agent's perspective? Now, it's sort of cast as sort of the subjective kind of thing, but it's still, at the end of the day, subjective because different people can look at the same situation somewhat differently. And the agency says, well, they really put themselves in the shoes of the agent, which, to some extent they should do, but I think they can go overboard and be too sympathetic and not consider, were there other ways to de-escalate the situation? Did the person just sort of escalate beyond what the circumstances called for? Were they quick to fire their guns? I mentioned the Raymond Matea case from 2023 from Arizona, and I've watched that video many, many times. It is a very troubling video. So these Border Patrol agents, they're called to help out local tribal police in response to some shots being fired at night. The video, which is you can see the video from 3 different body-worn cameras perspective. they're out. It's a very rural area in the desert. They're looking for a possible shooter, and they see this man, Raymond Matea. And, they're shining their flashlights on him. Their guns are out. This guy, Raymond Matea, they're like, throw any weapon you have. And he has a sheathed machete. It's not out of its sheath. Raymond Matea throws it away from him. They also yell conflicting orders to Raymond Matea at the same time. One yells, put your hands up. Another one says, get on the ground. I forget what the third agent says. And Raymond Matea puts his hands up as he's ordered. This is all within a split second. And then they fire, all three of these agents fire at him, like just immediately. At the beginning of the video, you hear some audio from one of the agents who's really like primed and ready to go. He seems like he's getting like an adrenaline rush from this like deployment that really doesn't have anything to do necessarily with the Border Patrol's mission. And it just creates a picture of, were they quick to fire at Raymond Matea? They clearly thought it seems that they thought he had a gun, because the video then shows them saying, or you can hear them saying, where's his weapon? Where's his weapon? All he had was a cell phone in his hands. And so when he pulled his hands up, they may have thought that cell phone was a gun, but the video shows that he didn't point anything at them, and he was just complying with their orders. So, the family clearly thinks that was an excessive use of force, and this federal judge did not find the agent's arguments persuasive and is allowing that lawsuit to move forward.
But the agents were not criminally prosecuted, right?
No, the Justice Department has announced and told the family that they declined to prosecute the case.
And the agents are still on the job.
Yes, I think they may be on administrative leave, but they were put on administrative leave at one point. I don't know what their current status is.
So here's the point of all this, and the reason for me reaching out to you, and thank you for this discussion, because I could talk to you about Bovino and use of force forever. It's my understanding that U.S. Border Patrol are not peace officers. They themselves would call their organization paramilitary. They have a lot of former military as part of the Border Patrol force. They are trained as quasi-military. So now they're being deployed on city streets within the boundaries of the United States. They're dealing and interfacing with civilians. They're not police officers. So for Bovino to shoot tear gas into a crowd of protesters, or to shoot a minister in the head with a pepper ball, spray or whatever it is, for Bovino to be called into court for excessive use of force against the public, this isn't new for them. This is the way they operate. This is how they manage the U.S.-Mexico border for the most part, or the interior when they are in the interior, and they're not used to being watched. They're not used to being reprimanded. I mean, I think, am I right to say that Bovino didn't even have his body cam on, maybe on purpose? So talk a little bit about what we're seeing on city streets in the U.S.
So the body cam issue is a very interesting one as it pertains to Bovino specifically. So he was hauled in before this federal judge, Sarah Ellis, in Chicago. And one of her questions was, do you wear a body camera? And he said, no. 99%. He said, he used the statistic of 99% of agents. I don't know if it's actually 99% of agents, but he said 99% of agents have body-worn cameras in the Border Patrol, but I do not. And she said to him, I bet you could get one if you asked. And she required that he wear a body camera and be trained properly on its usage. So he has not been using body-worn cameras, despite having a team of filmmakers, agency filmmakers traveling around creating these sort of action movie style videos that they put out that are quasi, if not outright propagandistic. I also want to point out that that in Los Angeles, there was a lawsuit. It was mainly focused on whether or not the deployment of National Guard violated the Posse Comitatus Act. And it led to a ruling that there were some legal violations in that deployment. But in a footnote, federal judge Charles Breyer, called out Bovino for the deployment in MacArthur Park in Los Angeles on Father's Day this year. According to the evidence that Judge Breyer reviewed, Bovino was even questioning the loyalty of a National Guard general because that National Guard general said, is this deployment in MacArthur Park a good idea because the safety of the public could be at risk? Popular park, Father's Day weekend, it seemed to be designed to agitate and piss off people. It didn't seem to have any like sort of proper legitimate purpose to do it that way in that place at that date. And, Bovino questioned this guy's loyalty. There's a very interesting interview by Bovino from 2023 that was conducted by congressional staff that really has flown under the radar. I mean, I've read it multiple times at this point. So he was brought in by House Republicans because they were trying to build an impeachment case against the then Homeland Security Secretary Mayorkas. But they talked to Bovino about his career in the Border Patrol, his views on border security. Bovino has an exceptionally expansive view of what border security is, and it is a militaristic perspective on border security. And now he's been unleashed in American cities, but the violence that they're using in American cities has been used on the border far from sort of the public eye for many years. And so that's playing, I think there's been a lack of accountability because they've just been far from major media outlets. Even despite the remoteness of a lot of their operations, they still get a lot of negative news coverage, but they've never been held to account the way you would see a city police department like the LAPD or the New York Police Department. Not to say that there aren't, problems with those police departments, but they've never really been held to account. I want to also mention something that plays into this militaristic issue is the Border Patrol seems to want it both ways. They want to be seen as sort of a military or quasi-military unit, but they have a union. And in the federal government, if you're in the U.S. military, you are not allowed to have a union. They have an extraordinarily strong union at the Border Patrol that has created a lot of connections to the highest levels involving President Trump himself.
They endorsed President Trump.
Yes, it was the first, in 2016, it was the first time the Border Patrol Union...
police agency endorsing a candidate, right.
Yeah. In 2016, it was the first time the National Border Patrol Council, which is their official name, endorsed a presidential candidate. They endorsed him in 2016. They endorsed Trump again in 2020. They endorsed him again in 2024. You have people like Art Del Cuero, who was a Border Patrol Union vice president in the local in Arizona. He's, was bringing Dr. Phil on the border in December 2024. And, so they're quasi like campaign surrogates almost. And so you have this at a time when federal government unions are broadly under attack from the Trump White House. This is one of the few exceptions to that. Yet they want to be considered a national security agency, but then they want the benefits of not being a national security agency. So you have sort of a lack of accountability both ways. They get secrecy and sort of the broad discretion that national security agencies get, but they get that without the accountability that you would see in the U.S. military. The U.S. military, again, not a perfect organization, pretty strict codes of conduct. There's pretty strict discipline if you go outside of that code of conduct, but you don't see sort of a comparable situation when it comes to the Border Patrol. People are rarely held accountable when they take individual acts that go too far, and institutionally they've been told to go too far now.
I mean, I'm going to editorialize a little bit because I can, because this is a podcast. I know that you're sticking very strictly to your reporting, which I appreciate. U.S. Border Patrol is starting to take command of these raids. They're really not ICE raids anymore. The command structure has started to shift more towards Border Patrol taking the lead as Bovino is doing. So what we're going to start to see, I'm going to look out into the future here. What we're going to start to see is this heavy-handed Border Patrol agency running these raids. They're more Border Patrol raids than they are ICE raids, and you're basically now unleashing a military style force into U.S. cities. And those are the tactics that they're using. These are not peace officers. These are not people who ask questions first. They're going to tackle people, arrest people, not ask questions, suspect people. I mean, what we're seeing is a militarized approach to getting rid of or deporting undocumented immigrants. And I think this is going to escalate. Do you see it that way?
I mean, there's a reason why they're changing the leadership structure at ICE and replacing, longstanding ICE officials or more traditional career ICE officials with folks from the Border Patrol. Is the White House, they want more arrests. The ICE, as much as it's been criticized, over the years, they do have sort of more of a systematic approach to interior enforcement, and the Border Patrol's enforcement model is different. They do use this sort of more paramilitary approach. They're deploying tear gas, pepper balls, using force a lot more than ICE. ICE. I think ICE also. When you talk about ICE, there's sort of two main sides of ICE. There's enforcement and removal operations, which is really what we mostly think of with ICE. And then there's the HSI, or Homeland Security Investigations, which has traditionally done a lot of work involving transnational crime, smuggling, not necessarily, going after undocumented immigrants in the interior of the country, although they've been sort of roped into that, especially this year. But yes, I mean, they are trying to ramp it up to get 3,000 arrests a week. They're, I think, hovering around 1,300 arrests a week. And so swapping out these ICE folks with people from the Border Patrol, it signals that, they're trying to get those arrest numbers up a lot. Whatever your status is, be damned. We're seeing even U.S. citizens getting arrested in these operations. So they are taking a very broad brush, aggressive approach under Bovino, and these folks at the Border Patrol who are sort of taking over ICE.
What could possibly go wrong?
A lot of things can go wrong. There was a news article, which is a bit outside of the scope of this, that says that ICE wants to start hiring bounty hunters to identify undocumented immigrants. So there's a lot that can go wrong with this approach. Border Patrol, as we've seen in LA and Chicago, they're often quick to escalate things. I mean, these are videos anyone can watch. I mean, you've probably seen many of these. One of the more striking ones that I saw was a house where the front door and one of the windows was like blown open, and there were small children inside. And the target of the operation, who was a U.S. citizen, wasn't even there. And I mean, it's just, boggles the mind, like what they're doing. And I think there are a lot of people who see this as just like, well, these immigrants deserve it. We need these aggressive approaches. But at the end of the day, the vast, vast majority of the people getting rounded up and arrested have no violent criminal histories at all, or even criminal records at all. We're rounding up many U.S. citizens even. It's just, I think it's something we should all be worried about. If people are worried about government overreach, this is like case study number one these days.
Agree, and a great place to end this particular segment. Thank you for all of that.
Thank you, John.
Thank you for listening to The Raid, available wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about our guests and the subjects we cover, please visit our website at theraidpodcast.org.